Good evening and welcome everybody. This is our last talk of this series. So thank you so much for supporting us all through this year and previous. Thanks very much. Before we start properly, could you please mute your telephones, if you've got any on you? And if we have any incident that we need to leave this building, if it's safe to do so, we'll go through the door that you've come in through. If not, you go through this little door here, turn right, and there's a fire escape to let you out onto in that room. Right, let's get on with it. Welcome to Arwyn. Owen is a long-time Anglesey resident. He was brought up just outside Llangollen, where he has been involved in researching various sites in the area with the likes of Mike Wood and Professor George Nash. Owen did his undergraduate degree in Welsh History and Archaeology at Bangor University in 2010, before a brief hiatus working in the heritage sector. Returning to academia in 2022, he received a Master's by Research and is currently on his third year of his PhD studies, so his last year finishes next April, I think.
Next April, that's it.
Wonderful. The Viking impact in Wales, particularly North West Wales, has been the subject of considerable debate over the decades. This evening's talk will discuss all the evidence, old and new, which gives us a glimpse of life in Wales during the turbulent 9th to 11th centuries AD. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Just want to check, audio check, can everyone hear me in the back? Yes. Perfect, because I can shout if needed, but that's fine. So what this talk will be is slightly informal, because I will be like the proverbial blue-arsed fly. I'll be moving from areas to areas, and that's because of the nature of the investigation of Viking activity in Wales from the 9th to 12th century, because a lot of our sources are quite limited, and this is not a new thing. This was something that was noted even as far back as 1974. So this historian here, H.R. Owen, was the first to make a sort of synopsis about Viking activity in Wales. And this is his quote here, that he comes back to his initial belief of the Vikings in Wales. He tried to use the word backlash, but the word peripheral now comes to mind. And we see years later, W. Davis says the same sort of thing, where any evidence of Viking settlement or urban settlement is distinctively lacking. And that's because at that time there just simply wasn't enough physical evidence. There were a few historical find spots recorded in antiquarian journals from the 19th century, such as a hoard of coins found in Midland Bank in Bangor in the mid-19th century. But these finds were few and far in between, and obviously a lot has developed since then, with the science of archaeology becoming better understood and more rigorous frameworks for investigation implemented. So we've got these quotes here, and obviously things haven't stopped since then. Further research has been done in many places. We've obviously got the excavations in 1994 to 2012 of Llanbedrgoch, a site called Glyn there, which is a multi-period site with activity spanning from the Neolithic right through to the early medieval period. Obviously, the interest of that is the Viking Age trading centre, which is implied by Mark Redknapp based on the quantities of Scandinavian-influenced metalwork, artefacts, and even human remains that were found there. More on that later. But a synopsis in early medieval Wales by Nancy Edwards, Professor Nancy Edwards, then of Bangor University, is a more up-to-date chronological overview along complementing this. So both of these sort of give us a better idea now to what it was in the past about how the Vikings used to live, particularly in North Wales. And I can't not mention metal detecting. The rise of metal detecting, although a bane for some archaeologists, has been a boon for others in a way, because the ethical detecting, where they record their objects and bring them to museums to be studied, has been instrumental in in developing our understanding of early medieval Wales, and particularly North Wales. There's a few interesting objects that have been found and recorded on the Portable Antiquity Scheme from the area, which I show, one of which from Penmaenmawr, which will be quite interesting to see. But all in all, have things really changed that much? Short answer is no, but long answer is no but. Because there is new stuff that has come out with recent research that shows that while Wales's involvement is still sort of peripheral compared to other places like the Danelaw, Eastern Ireland, the Scottish Atlantic Isles, Scotland itself, and of course Northern Europe, we still have a presence of Viking activity here which can be traced. And I've got this little timeline here. It's a bit clustered because I'm going to be including this in the PhD, but you can see that's not nothing happening here. There is a lot going on here, and we can see that really it starts more or less from 825 AD, where we've got Penmaenmawr, who leaves Isle of Man to secure power in Gwynedd. It's believed that the Isle of Man was once part of the Kingdom of Gwynedd, but control was wrestled from it from the Vikings, who established permanent Scandinavian settlement and authority there from 825 onwards. The very first Viking raids that have been recorded on the island date back to 854, which is on Anglesey, but previously the very first record of Viking activity is 852, where we've got this individual called Cyngan, probably a lesser prince or a Welsh lord somewhere in mid-Wales. He is killed by, as described, by pagan forces, which we attribute to the Vikings, probably coming over from Eastern Ireland, fancying a scrap, fancying a bit of raiding. And this activity continues, and the nature and the dynamic of Viking activity changes. You'll see in this presentation some of the early Viking activity was violent and belligerent, but at other times there were elements of cooperation and potentially peace between these new Scandinavian arrivals and the native Welsh communities that were living here. But, sorry, let's go back. We've got three phases as defined by historians such as Mark Redknapp. This first phase, which is just raids, Viking raiding and opportunistic raiding, won by a few notable figures between 852 and 918 AD. The second phase, 942 and 998, there is a period in that later part of the 10th century where the raiding really intensifies, and there's almost this sense of something bigger being planned, possibly an attempt to establish a permanent Viking enclave in North Wales, which ultimately fails. And then by the third phase, the 11th to 12th century AD, we still see sporadic raiding, but there's this change then that comes in. And one figure whom I will attribute to there helps lead this sort of change. But we can see this trace of change traceable even as far back as the 9th century, 10th century AD. So our information about the Viking period is sporadic, and to understand the period we have to rely on a multitude of sources. I will go through each of these sources in order, but they will include things like documentary sources, contemporary sources that were written at the time of the Viking period, which are recorded in later chronicle texts, themselves problematic because of that reason and other reasons. You've got artifactual evidence, Christian sculpture, which shows evidence of Viking influence, settlement, which we've got a bit of evidence up around here, and of course burial. And that is also very key in understanding what is going on in the period there. Not so much as important as learning about the acts of the living in the landscape as the rites of the dead as well, particularly from communities outside the area. But our documentary sources, we do have some primary sources from the period, some of which are recorded in later chronicle texts. So Brut y Tywysogion, this example here dates from the 12th century, latter half of the 12th century, but it does contain chronicles and texts and accounts of Viking activity. Then you've got Annals Cambriae, you've got Heimskringla, Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Annals of Ulster, and then the Brut y Saeson, which is another Welsh chronicle. But there's a pattern that you'll notice here, in particular with most of these documents. They're not held in Wales. many of the documents that relate to this period has been noted by Hugh Edwards as being kept in archives and institutions outside of Wales. And that's interesting in itself, but where have the original Welsh texts gone? Well, that's your first problem. Fewer than 20 surviving manuscripts can be associated with Wales and Cornwall before the 12th century. That's not a lot. If you compare it to other places, like particular England, many of the later Anglo-Saxon texts survive better than in Wales. And there is some reasonings behind possibly what's happened here. So this is Hugh Price attributing the loss of some of these pre-Norman artefacts. In this instance, I will suggest manuscripts could be fairly recent, because we find records of many of these Welsh estates in the post-medieval period from the 17th century right through to the 19th century, having many of these old documents, some of which are reported by historians in later period, but the originals just have not survived, most likely because they've been kept in a damp attic or a basement and the rot has gotten to them and it's completely destroyed them. But this other point as well is raids by Norse, Welsh and Normans, followed by Protestant and Puritan destruction in the 16th and 17th century, must have taken their toll. We need only look at some of the medieval churches where we see defaced sculptures of saintly figures or local saints and deities, the destruction of shrines such as Penmaenmawr down in South Wales, and possibly 2 examples on Anglesey at Aberfraw and Amlwch. As a consequence, documents will have been destroyed, possibly by the Vikings themselves, raiding these church sites, these small estates or monasteries, and other which destroyed by the Welsh themselves, particularly if you've got documents relating to Scandinavian land ownership. Because the point to consider, this was something that was raised by another historian in their research into the Danelaw region of England. There is a possibility that these documents written by Scandinavian settlers in Wales may have been deliberately destroyed to make it easier to reclaim land or sort of territorial land disputes. And these are things you just got to think about when looking at these sources. The abstract nature of where they've gone, where they've ended up, it can boggle the mind at times. And as a consequence, these 20 surviving manuscripts, they can give us a glimpse of the past, but they'll never give us the full story unless more come to light. And it's a shame, really, because some of these documents are quite wonderful. They give us so much information about the period as well. And other issues as well. No Welsh chronicler produced a coherent story from the end to the 9th and 10th century. And that's because many of these chroniclers were monks. And unless it related to their locality or their area or their monastery, they couldn't give a toss what was going on beyond them. The smaller churches, the smaller villages being raided by the Vikings, this must have been going on, but they won't have recorded it because it's outside the periphery of their interest. But if you talk about Caergybi getting raided or the Welsh court of Aberfraw, whoa, that's a big deal. We've got to report that. But a little chapel on Tywyn or near Penmaenmawr, yeah, it's all right. I'm sure they'll be fine. They'll be up in the mountains somewhere. But there really must have been some permanent Scandinavian sale in Wales, and we should not attach too much weight to the lack of analytic reference to it. And that's the key point here. And this is what I mentioned with we need these other sources to come in. Because although we do have evidence of Viking activity here from all these sources, it is these other sources of scientific information that we can glean from the architecture and the archaeology that gives us a much fuller account of what's going on in Viking Age North Wales. And this is that first thing. I translated the Welsh there, so it's bilingual, so everyone can enjoy the text. 850 was the year of Christ, when Cungan was killed by the pagans. 3 years after that, the Vikings were ravaged by the Black Nation, or the pagans, again. So the Black Nation could be referring to the Norwegians. And it's interesting because the texts in Wales, they seem to differentiate between the groups. So we may be seeing differentiation between Norwegian Scandinavian raiders, Hiberno-Norse, i.e. Irish Scandinavian Viking raiders, and Danish raiders as well. You can see it by the Cenedloedd Du, Cenedloedd Wen, all these sort of names that come in from the text. And we also get names of notable Viking individuals from the text here. So here's the first one, Gorm, which I think is a really cool name for a heavy metal band lead singer. He is the first and earliest reference to a named Viking figure. We've got no idea who he is. He may have come from a colony of Hiberno-Scandinavian settlers from Ireland. He may have come further afield. But he meets his match in North Wales. Rhodri Fawr kills him. So, bygone. We get this other individual now, Penmaenmawr. Now, he is an interesting character. So, his arrival in North Wales coincides with the expulsion of Vikings from Ireland in 901 AD. He is likely an elite Hiberno-Norse figure, possibly a chief, and he didn't come alone. He brought a war band with him. And it is implied that the massive hoard of silver, the Cordale hoard, may have been part of his war chest, part of a wider campaign. He came to Anglesey, he tried to take it over, he invaded, attacked a place called Maes Osmelion, which is believed to be somewhere in Llanfaes, sets up a temporary camp somewhere on the island, we're not sure where, immediately gets his snot kicked in, and he has to retreat, and it is implied that the Kingdom of Gwynedd and its forces rout them every way until they reach England, to Chester. Penmaenmawr tries to get sanctuary in Chester. The Queen of the area agrees. He tries to take over Chester. So he gets kicked out again. And it is implied that he dies somewhere in Lancashire in 910 AD, although the facts aren't clear. All we know is at 910 AD, his name completely vanishes from the history books. So goodbye, Penmaenmawr. Now we've got two of the biggest people that is in the historical account. Two I feel which have had the greatest impact in the history of Wales, particularly in terms of notable Vikings from the 10th century. And this is Magnus Haraldsson and his brother Guthfrith. Now Magnus is described as the king of many isles. He was a very powerful Viking king of the Scottish Atlantic Isles and possibly owned isles everywhere else. He was a son of a descendant of Ivar, which is one of the chief founders of the Kingdom of Vikings in Ireland, in Dublin. So he had some pedigree to him, and him and his brother caused all manner of chaos to the Welsh. And mainly it was because of, it is believed, a slighting by the one of the Welsh princes at the time, Idwal Foel, who was successful in repelling the Vikings, but upon his death, the situation in Gwynedd, which you find in many of the Welsh prince histories, deteriorates with brothers fighting over land and so on and so forth. But they come in and try and take advantage of it, and it is believed they did try to set a permanent enclave of Vikings in North Wales, possibly Anglesey, but their efforts are thwarted. Guthfrith Haraldsson is believed to be killed in Ireland in 989, according to an Irish chronicle, and something happens to Magnus. He just seems to drop off the map at 984, and it's believed that was at a time where his sovereignty over his title as King of Many Isles was being threatened by other Vikings seeking to take claim of his territories. It's no wonder, because the guy was mostly down here, so he couldn't keep an eye on his stuff up there, so it might explain why he was having a struggle. He was too busy campaigning rather than controlling his assets. But either way, we say goodbye to those two as well. And there are a few other named Vikings, one of which being Magnus Barelegs, who comes up later at the Battle of Anglesey Sound in 1098 AD. He is associated with another figure. And this figure is quite interesting because this is where we're starting to see in the documentary sources more of a sort of amicable relationship by some of these Welsh people towards the Vikings. This is Arms Prydain. This was written by a Welsh monk at some time in the 9th century. It's found in the book of Taliesin. And it, one of the quotes here, as you can see here, heroic men rise a tumult of fierce contention, swifter and remorse of defending too long, the reconciling of the Cymry and the men of Dublin. In that instance, what they're meaning for is the Vikings. Not the Gwyddil or the Iwerddon, but the Vikings from Dublin there. And the idea was the Arms Prydain is literally a call to arms to unite all the nationalities and ethnic identities of Britain at the time, the Scottish, the Irish, the Scandinavians and the Welsh, to repel the Saxon threat, as it were. And then what we'll see as well, in some of the Welsh chronicles, we get these records here. So this is Custennin ap Iago, son of Iago, who is a relative of Idwal ap Foel. He is involved in a raid on Anglesey and Penllyn with Gwthfrith, the individual here. He is jointly involved because he sees the Vikings not as a threat, but as a potential ally in reclaiming the throne. This was in 979. He dies a year later fighting his brother, so that didn't work out for him. By Custennin. And then what we get then with Magnus Bearlegs, this figure which almost seems to unite the Hiberno-Norse and Cymric worlds, which is Gruffydd ap Cynan. He's a fascinating figure. His mum was Irish, but Viking Irish from Dublin, and his father was a Welsh prince. And he rises to power a few times with the help of Scandinavian forces, but he doesn't get it quite right initially. In fact, one of his attempts to reclaim the kingdom of Gwynedd, he seems to fail to pay his men, and his men repay this kindness by raiding and ransacking the landscape, which forces him to go back home. But it is believed to be that he did have connections with Viking elite leaders elsewhere in the world. How else would you explain the arrival of Magnus Bearlegs' men? Was this coincidence, or was this a plea by Gruffydd ap Cynan which somehow made its way to the King of Norway? And the other theory, of course, is that Magnus Bearlegs mistook Anglesey for the Isle of Man, which I doubt that. He would have been familiar with both places. Alternatively, Magnus saw Anglesey as another place to conquer with his army, but with a vassal like Gruffydd, who was half Viking by his side, he probably thought, I'll leave you to look after it. And the success, Gruffydd ap Cynan's biological lineage may have also helped as well with establishing a more friendly Viking presence. Certainly there's this argument that the Norman forces of England left Wales alone for nearly 2 centuries because they were so afraid of Viking influence and naval power on the Irish Sea at this time. It wasn't until you usually see this collapse of the Viking powerhouse in Dublin and of course the Isle of Man by around the time of Llywelyn the Great that we do see this sort of change there in the waters. But the Vikings, from the documentary sources, we basically have a very, it's complicated status on Facebook. That's how you describe them. But the other evidence we've got from the Vikings is toponymic. So I've got this rather lovely satellite image of North Wales from SACE, from the Science Photo Library. When you think of Vikings, you think of big burly men and boats. And so obviously they were very keen sailors, and many of which would have been sailing along and across the Irish Sea. Obviously with Dublin being nearby, they would have seen Anglesey and the North West Wales, particularly Anglesey, as a sort of perfect staging point for a half a day's journey between Dublin and the northwest of England. So that would have been quite important to them. And certainly we've got this inclination of North Wales having some kind of importance, particularly with navigation, because we do get place names that occur to them. And many of these place names were recorded by this individual here called Melville Richards. He's an interesting character. He was a lecturer at Bangor University for a time, and he did produce this absolutely incredible database of place names, hundreds of thousands of names, on his own volition. He wasn't paid to do it. He just chronicled it just because he recognized the importance of these names in identifying areas of settlement, ideas of sort of cultural, societal ties to landscape, descriptions of areas which survive in the Welsh language. It's an incredible record and a testament to his work. And we could trace these names, particularly in old maps and in some cases, texts from the Viking period. And this was one of my little sort of quests. I always wondered how old Anglesey, the name Anglesey was, because everyone says it's a Viking name. Could either mean Ongle's Isle, which is the name given to some Viking chief that has not survived, which I'm beginning to think is problematic, because if he didn't survive, if there was a Viking chieftain there, I should say, sorry, why have we got not records of him anywhere in the text and stuff? They may not have survived, but we should see more of an impact on him in the landscape. Instead, I believe it's a toponymic descriptor, Angle Isle, because the island looks like a fish hook, if you look by the shape of it. does look a bit like a fish hook, so Hook Isle. And I think that's more of a plausible interpretation of the name. But I was stuck for a while trying to find the earliest source for this name, because you see it in the medieval text, late medieval text, but I was like, I need to find one that is from the Viking period, at least one that we can attribute with some degree of confidence to the Viking period. And there is actually a reference to it. And this is the Heimskringla, which you saw a page of previously, written by a Skaldic poet called Snorri Sturluson, probably from the Orkney Isles or the Scottish Atlantic Isles. And there he writes about the battle that occurred in Anglesey Sound. Very dramatic, very Viking, as you see there. The trees are lofty contrived, tips of spears flew fast, where arms spread in Ongursund, the end of Hugi in Prudi, so the Earl Hugh of Shrewsbury, when he's killed by an arrow to the eye. Very Harold Godwinson. But that's that name, Ongursund, and that is the earliest iterance of the name Anglesey in a text. The text itself is 12th century, but it is based on Skaldic oral poetry. So there is a degree of confidence one could tentatively attribute to that being probably a genuine name that was spoken by the Viking communities in the 12th century. How long does that name go back? Was that being used by people even prior to this? Were they being used by Guthfrith and Maccus or Ingrimunder? We don't know, but certainly we could trace that name back to the 11th century with some degree of confidence. As for place names, some of these you will see around the landscape today. We've got Anglesey, as I mentioned, Ongley Hook Isle. We've got Priesthulmer, which is Unisarial, which is a little island on the end of Anglesey there. This is a new one to me, which is a rock called Maen Pisker, which is near Roscollin, or Fiskur, fish. Bardsey Island, obviously, Unisently, Skerries. But what you'll notice is we've got the Welsh names tend to be completely different to the Scandinavian names. And there is this possibility that, compared to areas like the Danelaw region of England, the Scandinavian language doesn't seem to get as much of a threshold in Wales, because compared to the south, many places people still use the Welsh names for these places. They don't use the English ones, although the English ones have survived through the English chronicles that record these Viking names. So it's possible to argue, based on some historian accounts, that this could be evidence of the limited nature of Viking settlement, simply because if we had more Viking settlement here, we'd see more Viking place names like Bee and Thorpes, like Scunthorpe or Grimsby, but we just don't see them here. All of our names can be found denoting areas around the coast, or sort of navigational points. And that seems to be the case. Obviously, Anglesey refers to the big island, but that would have been something that they would have navigated around as well. Our next bit of evidence is sculpture, and particularly early Christian sculpture. These can be sculpted stones, grave slabs, cross slabs, standing crosses, that sort of thing. And this was something that was noted for a long time. Edward Llwyd made records of these stones in the 17th century, travelling around where he would make description of stones. So there has been an interest in sculpted stones for quite some time, but it's the investigations of these stones and the intricacy of them, the artistic motifs of their patterns that give us an idea of the origins behind them, or at least the artistic origin behind them, because many of which show evidence of Scandinavian motifs which appear. So border ring knot and complex knots, and in some case, iconography and symbolism. So we've got some of the notable examples which show these patterns here. We've got the Penmaenmawr stones, AN51 and AN52. These are two of the most notable ones here, where we've got evidence of Christian symbolism in there, mixed with these sort of Viking motif decorations, which you will see in places like Northern England, Isle of Man, and obviously Eastern Ireland. And that's probably where this influence has come from for these sculptures. You'll also see it on the fonts as well, Cerrig Cain, Wenellangristiolus. Both of these, interestingly, near Malltraeth. And Malltraeth, if you could believe it, Anglesey wasn't one big island, it was four. So you had Holy Island, which at the time would have been split by the sea as a salt marsh between it where Triada Bay is, and where Anglesey, the main island, is now, the Traeth Marsh, or the Cobb there, that was sea travelling as far as Llangefni. It would have been navigable by boat. So there's certainly evidence to suggest that it's possible that these could have been the result of Viking people coming into the area and settling, paying lip service to the gods by saying, oh yeah, I'm totally Christian, and then just paying for these inscriptions there. But there are other theories suggest this. The alternative theory, which could be these are just travelling workers, travelling craftsmen from Ireland who are commissioned by native Welsh elites to carve monuments, and they decide to carve it in their own unique style, which seems to go down a treat with the Welsh elite because it makes them seem a bit more modern, a bit more in connection with a wider world outside their own. And we've got other evidence of sculpture here. This is a little stone which is actually under the bell cut of Llanfihangel Trebeirdd, which is influenced, got Scandinavian influence there with parallels to the stones in Dublin. And then we've got Newborough here, and finally one from outside the island, this lovely boring knot decorated font from Pistill in the same peninsula. None in Conwy, unfortunately. I've not found one anywhere there, which is a shame. They might have existed, but the problem we get with sort of investigating these monuments is that the record is likely incomplete. And the reason for that being is people didn't seem to want to leave old churches alone in North Wales. You find evidence, particularly in the 19th century, as places develop and become more wealthy, they want to modernise their town, and as such, many of these old buildings, such as churches, are the first to be redeveloped in the English Gothic style, at the cost, in some instances, of medieval sculpture, which survived there. To give you an example, in 1859, where I'm from is a village in Llanfihangel, the church there presently is English Gothic style, which I bloody hate, because there was a drawing done by Lewis Morris in the 1730s, which shows a simpler building, but in some ways much more ancient than the present one. And an antiquarian account records traces of ancient crosses on the gable, which are gone. None of them have survived in the rebuild, and they've probably been consolidated into the fabric, either the foundations or in the walls of the building. And that makes you wonder how many churches possibly in Conwy, particularly around the coast, particularly around the River Conwy itself, have been redeveloped, and any traces of this earlier fabric, any traces of the early art, has been reconsolidated and now lost to us. Because if there's no record of it, we can't possibly prove it exists. I'm reminded, I did work recently in Llangefni, and in a place called Bringwylan there was a early Christian inscribed stone with Vere found it, inscribed on it, found upside down in a field in the 1970s. There's no antiquarian accounts of it, just a total freak discovery. And so there's a possibility as well that some of these Viking-influenced masonry may still exist in the landscape. We just need to find it. And that is a challenge in itself. But if we're going by place name evidence, Llandudno maybe might be a good place to start, and possibly along the River Conwy. And all these examples we can chronologically date to between the 10th to the very early 11th century. And this is sort of a time period which, as I say, coincides with Macus and Guthfrith's sort of period of invasion and consolidation and attempted conquest. And perhaps from this period we start to see more of an influx of Vikings and Scandinavian settlers into the area, which for some reason just didn't leave a mark. The third thing is the shinies. So the hoards and isolated find spots. And this is again where metal detectors have come into handy. Our knowledge of these find spots has increased dramatically since the 1970s. More have come to light. Some new finds have been discovered and have been recorded on things like the Portable Antiquity Scheme. As promised, this is a lovely Anglo-Saxon button head from Penmaenmawr in Conwy, which is about 8th to 9th century in date. Don't know where that is. The problem is, my personal gripe with the Portable Antiquity Scheme is people can record things but they won't find themselves in museums unless the detectorist is a very, very nice person. So this thing's gone somewhere. It's in someone's private collection. Wouldn't that be nice in Penmaenmawr Museum on display? But again, we just don't know. It's the same as this lovely little bronze plaque which shows evidence of Scandinavian decorative motifs here, sort of a zoomorphic shape there of a dragon or some kind of horse there, and these sort of lines there. That was found near Llanedwen in the field, gone. But the good detectorists, one of which has given Oriel Morn, whom I'm partnered with as part of my collaborative doctoral award, this sort of hack silver piece, probably from a bracelet, which is zoomorphic in style, probably a dragon of some kind. You can see its little eyes there, and the pellet decoration, reminiscent of other silver armguard hoards, such as ones found in Huxley down in Wirral, and obviously this hoard here, which was found in Red Dwarf Bay in a cave near Llangoed. The function of these hoards is not entirely clear. Some could be argued as simply hoards of wealth that were being deposited in the landscape to be collected later by a Viking. For some reason they never returned. Maybe they got killed in battle, maybe they forgot. Others suggest to believe that some of these may have been deliberately left as sort of portions of a grander treasure, possibly as a way of thanking the deities, the pagan deities that allowed them this opportunity, this great bountiful fortune to come home with them. But recently another theory has come into play, which I found quite interesting. It's possible that some of these silver hoards I found here are attempts by Scandinavian elites to sort of buy and curry favour with Welsh elites, giving them gifts of value of silver. Because we need to remember, by the 9th century, Wales economically was poorer than other areas. We never minted our own coinage, apart from the examples from Hywel Dda, of which there's only 2. So something like this would have been received very favourably by the Welsh elite. And these things could have been used as sort of diplomatic sort of means of giving money. Or in some cases, if one of their ancestors had raided them, obviously, just kind of go, oh, sorry, Dad, kicked the snot out of you. Here's some silver, forgive me, please. And then sort of re-establish good relations. Good for trade, good for markets. Here's another coin here. This is one close at home, Bryn Mawr Gwynan's Llandudno Conwy. This was found in the 1970s by a metal detectorist. All silver coins which date to the 11th century. Found a little hole not far from the Great Orme there. And that again, same thing. Is this an act of hoarding for recovery later? Is this ritual deposition? Or is this efforts by Viking individuals to curry favour in the community? Who's to say? But during the investigations into the portable antiquity scheme, one object caught my eye. And unfortunately, much like this one, I have no idea where it's gone, because it's such a fascinating object if you consider its history. This is a strap mount here, and you can see the decoration is very reminiscent of the bracelets. Now we can see there, so it's certainly influenced by them. And it probably dates to around the 9th, 10th centuries AD. It's got this rather intricate wiring that's placed in there, and this would be part of the strap end. It was declared treasure, and was recorded as such on the portable antiquity scheme. Again, I don't know where it's gone. I hope / love to think it's ended up in the National Museum of Wales, if it's ended up somewhere. But if it hasn't yet, it would be nice to have it back here, maybe in Conwy Culture Centre, because these things are not 10 a penny. But there's possibly an association with this object and a 9th century battle that would have happened in Conwy at a place called Cymrit. It's recorded in the antiquarian sources. The Battle of Conwy, the avenging of Rhodri by God. So Rhodri Fawr was killed by Saxon forces, and his sons would attack a Saxon contingent somewhere in the Conwy Valley. It's believed to be here. And if you think about it, the find spot, somewhere around Henried, not far from there. So an argument can be tentatively made whether this object, because of its chronological date, is associated possibly with the Battle of Conwy. As for who owned it, it could have been a Scandinavian warlord, possibly a mercenary hired by either the Welsh or the Anglo-Saxon forces. Alternatively, could just be a bit of native fashion, external fashion, picked up by an Anglo-Saxon or Welsh warrior. We find, for example, the Scandinavians did also, in turn, take into sort of account native fashions where they occupied. So ring pins, which are notably Irish, the Vikings absolutely loved them. They made them almost like a European phenomenon wherever they travelled. But yeah, this site here is quite interesting. And it's this argument whether we could connect this to that somehow. Obviously, it would depend. We need to find more artefacts to prove that. But maybe a project of interest to someone in the audience that fancies having a little bit of a quest, if it were. Again, settlements. Now, these are limited in scope because we've only got very few that have been found and certainly been excavated in North Wales. This is a fantastic drawing by this chap here called Brad Alsop of a promontory fort in Trefadog, which is near the western coast of Anglesey, not far from Church Bay. It is an Iron Age promontory fort, which was later occupied in the 11th, 12th century with this hall built. We're not sure if it was native Welsh or whether it was Scandinavian people that occupied it. The excavation produced little diagnostic evidence, but the radiocarbon date gave us this broad chronological period to work with. And it's likely owned by a member of the elite, possibly a Scandinavian immigrant, which was given safe passage and permission to settle, not in the middle, right near the coast. Don't like you being right in the middle causing me a ruckus. Keep you as far as I can, but I can't say no. So that could be the theory about that one there. And this is the site as it looks today. Cadw have consolidated the site. They've cleared the ditches. And I believe that picture that you saw there is part of an information board in the site. It's accessible, obviously, by a public footpath and by the coast. Well worth a look. And its form is comparable to sort of these promontory forts that you see elsewhere, particularly on the Isle of Man, all of which have a contemporary date to this one, which is the 11th, 12th century. Obviously, the largest site and the most important site that has been found in recent times is Glyn in Llanbedr Goch. So here we've got this D-shaped enclosure. Originally, there would have been an earlier native enclosure here, 6th, 7th century date. This is the yellow one there. The purple line there is a massive stone wall, which would have surrounded a large ditch that would have defended the entire compound. And the artifactual evidence from this site has been numerous. We found evidence of craftworking, metalworking, trade, particularly commerce, these lovely little trading weights, some of which you can see on the end here. This one in particular has reused the terminal end of an Irish penannular brooch as decoration. They've just hacked it off and stuck it on a piece of lead. This one has also got decoration, probably from a similar piece of jewellery. And we've got evidence of smelters, metalworking, trade, craft, spindle whorls, whetstones, all manner of things there. And the evidence, as Mark Redknapp puts it, suggests that this is not just a simple Viking settlement. This is sort of a mercantile enclave settlement. Probably something that was set up during the 9th, 10th century. Particularly, may have been set up with permission by the Kingdom of Gwynedd, presumably because they were in such a weak position during this period. They couldn't either say no or they couldn't muster a force strong enough to kick them out at this time, which allowed the settlement to continue in existence. But there is evidence suggests that by the 12th century, this site was largely abandoned. And while we've got this defensive D-shaped enclosure there, we find native settlements also being defended, and it's possibly, as George Smith mentions about this enclosure here in Llanfair PG, these could be native defended settlements being built, defended in response to sort of rivalry between ruling families and competing influences from Norse Ireland and from the Normans in England. like I said, the history between Wales and the Scandinavians would have been a complex thing, and people would have been quite unsettled. The radiocarbon dating from this dates to around the 11th, 12th century, which coincides with this period of sort of unease. This would coincide as well with a period of rise of Griffith ap Cynan, whom, as we know, was great friends with the Vikings and also brought a few Vikings to kick some heads in that time if he didn't get his way. But we've also got this site. Now, this is a site that I found during my PhD at Llanfwrog. It is a polygonal enclosure. It shows up as a crop mark, clear as day on Bing satellite imaging. Toby Driver, if you had a chance to listen to his talk on Oriel Morn about Roman discoveries in Northwest Wales, was brilliant. He suggested that this is early medieval, and I believe, at the moment, my present theory, there was a book written by Philip York. It was around sort of early post-medieval period, called The Royal Tribes of Wales. And he goes into the tribes of Wales, such as the kingdoms of Gwynedd. But he also had this subtext called the 15 tribes of Gwynedd. And one of these tribes is the tribe of Llywach ap Bran. Llywach ap Bran was a native of Anglesey. It was believed that he had a homestead at a place called Trelywach, which is right next to where this site is. However, he is about mid to late 12th century, which puts it a bit too late for this. So I suggest it could be one of his ancestors, either his father or his grandfather, that built this in response to sort of an increasing Viking threat. Because in fact, this site here is only about a few kilometres to the sort of southeast of this site here at Trefadog. And it probably forms part of sort of this cluster of defended settlement with people being unsure of each other. The final piece of evidence that we've got is ritual and funeral evidence. And we've got some of this from the archaeological record in Wales. Here is a reconstruction of a male skull from Llanbedrgoch. This was famous when these were done in the 1990s. There was a book released by the National Museums, Vikings in Wales, and it was thought that these people were all a family group, that they were all related to each other because they all shared similar facial features. However, advances in scientific analysis in the archaeological record suggests that's not the case anymore. In fact, something more interesting is going on. So we've got these two burials here. This is an adolescent male, and this is a young adult male who's about between 25, 35 years of age. They did something called isotopic analysis, and what that is everything we eat and ingest in our body, we absorb radioactive isotopes from. And as we die, these isotopes are retained in our bones. We can analyze elements like strontium, calcium, and determine where these sources of isotope came from the landscape, because concentrations of these sort of isotopes can be used to determine geographic locations. Some springs, for example, in places produce more strontium, whereas other springs produce more calcium. And from the analysis of these bones, this young chap here, not related to him at all, it's implied from the data that he may have come originally from Hereford. So, and this gentleman here, he may have come even as far away as Norway. So what are they doing in a pit along a ditch around the settlement at Llanbedrgoch? Well, there is a possible macabre reason for this. These are what you would describe as deviant burials, where they've just been thrown into a hole and buried quickly and haphazardly, their bodies sort of contorted and bent in weird shape. Not like a traditional burial inhumation where the body is stretched and lying flat on the back. These have been chucked in. In fact, these two individuals were chucked one on top of each other. It is implied that they may have possibly been slaves. And slaves and the slave trade, particularly in the Viking period, was big business. We have this source here from Annals Cambriae about a raid in North Wales by Guthfrith Haraldson and his brother Macrus on Anglesey, where they captured 2,000 fighting men, and the Kingdom of Gwynedd has that Maredydd here, he has to pay a penny a head for each of them to buy their freedom. And it was big money, and a lot of the slavery market was being fueled by the rise of the Arabic kingdoms in the Middle East at this time. We find in the record, the artifact record, a lot of these silver dirhams entering in. And it's possible that many of these sort of people are finding their ways being sold on global slave markets. Horrendous practice. And while we could condemn the Vikings for this, the Welsh did it too. We did capture slaves in war. In fact, Hyweldar's law, there is a value ascribed to slaves during the 9th century. So we did still capture slaves despite being perceived as a Christian nation. So just to add to the complexity here. Other human burials which are associated with Vikings is this burial here at Talakar. This is a picture from Llandudno Colwyn Bay District Field Club. This is found near an area of coast where a kist grave was found containing a skeleton, and near his body an iron spearhead. And what differentiates Christian and pagan graves is predominantly grave goods. You don't find grave goods with Christian graves. You're more likely to find them in pagan graves, especially weapons. And this spearhead here has been diagnosed as being distinctly Viking in style. This is another body which has got an interesting story to it because the skeleton's lost. No one knows where it's gone. It was recorded as being a part of the loan collection of Oriel Môn for a time in the 90s and loaned for the exhibition during the Llanbedr Goch excavations. The owner, got no idea who, has claimed it back and we don't know where it's gone, which is quite sad because obviously the technologies that we have now, such as isotopic analysis, would be incredibly useful in determining the origin of this individual, which was buried with a double-sided bone comb, not typically Viking. And there's been debate even about the gender of this individual, possibly something that could be sorted out with DNA analysis. Either it could be a young female or someone aged between 60 to 70 years, which is a bit of a leap between the two, isn't it? But we just don't know. Again, very similar to this burial here, found on a promontory near the coast. So coastal foci were very important for burial in sort of pagan communities in Britain. We find that particularly with the Vikings burying their dead near rivers, near great sources of water. Repton, for example, in Derbyshire, many of the burials there in the church, probably out taking into account the river running nearby it. You've also got some burials as well of Viking ships in Killoran Bay, Balladool, Knockaduni, for example, all of which positioned within a short distance from the coast. But I've got two other sites here of consideration. And I mention consideration only because I kind of looking into them. Not a lot of research has been done into them. So I'm sort of throwing these out there for someone that's interested in doing some legwork on research of their own. Because the potential for these sites cannot be understated. So this is a site that was disturbed and excavated around the 1920s, 30s by workmen, levelling the grounds around where Friars is now, Coleg Menai. This is the field 192, which is recorded in the OS 900 map, now presently a playing field. So the workers, as they were levelling the ground, they uncovered pits, some of which containing human remains, skeletal remains, and this stone here. Unfortunately, there is no evidence to suggest whether this stone was found on top of a grave or whether it was loose in the soil. But what's interesting about it is Nancy Edwards' sort of suggestion that it could be a hogback grave cover. Hogbacks are incredibly rare in Wales. There's only one other example known, and that's in mid Wales on the coast. This would be the second one known. It's on display currently in Storiel, in the storage area, past the suspension bridge on the corridor there. And you'll see a glass window on your side. As you look down, the stone is on display there. And probably is a crude hogback grave. Now, I wonder whether this hogback grave was found either here or here, because another theory by Nancy Edwards suggested that this cemetery was part of a mercantile community that would have existed outside Bangor. And we know there must have been something going on because of the 2 silver coin hoards that were found both in Midland Bank, which is in the, near the clock tower in Bangor, and the Vicarage Garden, again near the cathedral, both of which are of Viking date. And it's possible that this, if there were still standing remains, surviving remains of Viking age activity on the site, that these may relate to that, these coin hoards. Geophysical survey I would consider on this area, because although, yes, they will have destroyed a lot of surface remains there, we don't know really how deep they could have gone. And if there were ditches, particularly large ditches, there's a possibility that the traces of these, if they're associated with an enclosure, could still be in the field. So that might be an interesting project maybe for Coleg Menai, or someone in the audience here works for Coleg Menai, wants to do their own bit of research, to consider. And this is something I've recently posted about on Facebook. 1937 Royal Commission, it's basically like a survey of all the extant monuments, which includes find spots. There's this reference here to a spearhead. It's got this little incised decoration at the bottom here. That fell into an antiquarian's collection at Glynllifon, which is over sort of Carnarvonshire way. That's gone. No idea where it's gone. I'd like to do more research to see whether we could still find it, whether this collection has ended up in private hands elsewhere. It was apparently found at a place called Tynrossydd, which no longer exists. This is Penrose Park, which is this area here north of Holyhead. Now, to those familiar with Penrose Park, I'm sure there'll be some people that have heard that there's plans to develop a housing estate and stuff like that. That Penrose Park I'm talking about. And I believe that the spearhead may have formed part of a burial. That's only because of place name evidence, particularly 2 here, which we've got Penmaenmawr, or grave of the monk. So that's probably implying the presence of a graveyard or cemetery here. And given the proximity to Tynrossydd, there is a possibility that it may have come from a grave there. A Viking age ring pin was found in the cemetery at Llanfairpwll Church, St Mary's at Llanfairpwll, through digging a grave in the 1930s. So pagan burials within Christian cemeteries was not uncommon, clearly, in some places. And it's possible that this may have been a quick burial by someone. We don't know whether there was a kissed grave, we don't know whether it was an inhumation, could have even been a cremation, as we get with certain places in Derbyshire. But the other place name of interest is this one, Gorsedd y Penrhyn, so promontory mound. It could be a toponymic descriptor, because that does rise a bit in the landscape. But it's that name, Gorsedd Mound, which is interesting, because we don't see mounds on Christian graves, but we do see them on pagan graves. So again, some of the cremation cemetery that was found in Derbyshire, they've got burial mounds placed on top of them. Boat burial mounds, particularly in Scandinavia, have mounds covering them. So perhaps this name may indicate the presence of a burial mound that now much denuded or lost, that could still exist in this green area, assuming it's not been swallowed up by the woodland area there. So the final site was one I've been sort of keeping hush-hush. I've decided now's a good time that I need to make it public in a way. So this is a geophysical survey that I did on a site, I can't tell you where it is, in North Wales. And what was found was we've got this ring ditch here, which is about 10, 15, 30 metres across, with a 8 metre long central anomaly here. Looks a bit like the Eye of Sauron. So in terms of scale, 8 metres long is about the size of the stage. So from there to there. What is it? Well, operating theory, that's a Viking boat burial. So, why that's exciting? That's the only one in Wales. The only one that's so far been identified in Wales. There may be more, but this is the first of its kind to potentially be identified in Wales. I'm attempting to write an article about it, simply because it's such an exciting and rare site. And obviously there is a comparator to this site here that was found in a sort of mortuary complex in Norway. You can see the size and shape of it, nearly identical, even with the geophysical survey. Obviously, geophysical survey is prospective. It's not definitive. The only way we'll ever know what that thing is, digging it. And what could we expect to find with a Viking boat burial? Well, we could find all manner of things. So you could find weapons, you could find jewellery, ornaments, tools, all manner of things. The boat will not have survived. Wales' soil is too acidic for that. But my interest is this pit as well. Because in Knockaduni and the Isle of Man, this was excavated by a German archaeologist, Kermode, in 1927. He found in this pit a horse harness, which was elaborately decorated, that had been stuffed in the pit. And there's a possibility, if that is indeed a pit, that there may be other offerings put in. I believe one of the other Viking boat burials in the Isle of Man had a dog buried next to it. But the problem is, Wales' soil is very acidic. Bone does not survive. We don't expect organic remains to survive on the site, but we do expect metal. As for what would have covered the mound, it could be soil, or in the cases like sort of the Scar boat burial in Orkney Isles, there would have been a cairn of stones placed on top of them, particularly in the middle of the ship. We find evidence of that on several Scandinavian burials in Britain. But again, the only one in Wales, and so far the southernmost example to be found in Wales. Sutton Hoo doesn't count, that's Saxon. So in terms of Viking, this is the only one. And this dates to around 9th, 10th century AD, which coincides, obviously, with that period of more intensified Viking activity. This is another site of interest near Barmouth. A metal detectorist reported these finds on the Portable Antiquity Scheme on a little stretch of the coast there, which includes this rather lovely belt fitting here, which is about 10th, 11th century in date, with this much earlier Irish ring pin. What's not included in that, apparently this same detector has found a silver pyramidal mount with a garnet on top. And that, to me, implies we've got a burial there as well. Don't know what it is, but these sort of personal adornments, you're more likely to find on burial than on a landing point, and particularly its proximity to the coast. There is a church nearby, Owen, which has got origins from at least the early medieval period based on the inscribed stones there. So obviously another theory could be that this is just an accidental loss from a raiding party, maybe a victim who was just left and abandoned there while the natives stripped him of what he's worth, and these things just happened to fall out of his pockets and end up in the sand. But yeah, just to conclude then, this is a little map showing the distribution of every site, historical account, everything around North Wales, and I've put them next to floodplains because obviously the coastline of Wales would have been a lot different to it is now, and we can see there is an association between wetland areas, particularly areas near the coast, and Viking activity. What I've hoped to do, like I said, is my blue arse flyway, is show there's a lot going on here. Certainly nowhere near as enough that's going on in places such as the Danelaw region of England and other places in the British Isles, but certainly enough to get people thinking about the aspect of Viking activity in Wales. It's certainly more complex than we think, but there's still much more we need to learn and understand. And with discoveries such as that, obviously there's more to be found out there. So I just want to say thank you very much for listening, and if you've got any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Thank you. I was going to keep that boat a secret, but I just thought, nah.
I know, because I remember when you were over there.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask them, please? Yes.
Why did they bury the boat?
It's part of their ritual process, apparently. There's this theory to suggest that by burying a person in a boat, there'll be or persons. Because in Scar, for instance, they found 2 or 3 bodies in the boats there. So it could either be for one individual or several. The size of the boat, you could certainly fit more than one. And it would be an elite member of a community, or possibly a raiding party, maybe a warrior, maybe a woman as well. There are evidence of women boat burials, themselves buried with weapons as well. It was not just gender specific. Both men and women could be honoured with a boat burial. And the idea of being buried in a boat was preparing you for the afterlife. They wouldn't bury you in the nice boat, though. They'd bury you in the clapped out knackered thing that could barely float. But it would revive and revitalise itself into a fantastic ghost boat that would take you to the next life. You'll find that these are also almost always positioned in a way where it's facing a body of water, or in some cases avoiding something in the landscape that could hit it and cause it to lose its trajectory, which I found really interesting. But yeah, definitively pagan. Christians would not be buried in that sort of thing at all, because again, no grave goods. But yeah, fascinating all the same.
Do we have any more questions, Steve?
I have an observation. In Gaelic, Dougal and Fingal represent dark foreigners and blonde foreigners, and refer directly to the Danes being blonde and the Norwegians having dark hair. There was at that time the Norwegians had dark eyes as well, brown eyes.
So it's a physical characteristic, this dark and light foreigners. Interesting.
Yeah, so
okay.
In Scotland and in Ireland, Dougal and Fingal. Dougal means dark foreigner. Gal means foreigner. So like the Norse foreigner, the Norse Irish or the Norse Scottish.
Interesting.
And in the islands, and there was a differentiation between their ethnicity and also by time, because the Norwegian assaults were 200 or 300 years earlier.
Yes.
In a lot of cases, the Great Heathen Horde turns up much later.
Yeah.
But there was a different ethnic.
Well, if you think about it, Scottish Isles are the first thing you'd hit, wouldn't it? Because by going down there, Lindisfarne being a bit further south, it would make sense that you sort of see these sort of.
Come from the Orkneys, the island of Guernsey.
Oh right, okay.
Norwegians originally, and they were allowed to take slaves from English Northumbria, which is basically Newcastle.
Yeah.
They went for Geordies.
Well, someone has to.
And another relation is that a lot of the outposts, the smaller outposts, they were used for slaving, so that they went into the coast so that they could take the people and get straight out to sea.
That was the thing with Viking raids, wasn't it? Smash and grab was a big thing. It was the reason as well why they designed their boats flat, because they preferred landing on shingle beaches because they were bearings. So if you landed your flat boat on top, easy for you to push it off. Sandy beach though, particularly if it's wet, it'll suck the bottom of the boat, meaning you're less likely to get a quick and clean getaway, as it were.
When my ancestors landed in Scotland, when they got lands in 1040 in Cape Ness,
wow.
They dragged their boat onto the beach and set fire to it to show the locals they weren't going anywhere.
Oh, that's an interesting local legend. That's cool.
John, you'd like to
I
ask.
was particularly interested, as I expect quite a few people here, were by the button that was found in Penmaenmawr.
Oh yes.
Although I think you said with its whereabouts, well, you're not absolutely sure.
I'm not sure, no, because that's the nature of the portable antiquity. People record this stuff, but obviously with GDPR, trying to find out who owns this object is like at times getting blood from the stone. If they don't want you to find out where they are, or if they've still got it, they have the option not to tell you, and that's the problem.
Two questions, really.
Go on.
One is, do you know whether there was a record a fairly precise record for where in Penmaenmawr?
There will be, but again, it falls under GDPR and obviously landowner permissions as well, whether they're okay to release that data. Because the issue being as well, some of these landowners, they don't want hundreds of detectorists trampling over their land and causing a problem. But because that's recorded on GAT, you could ask Sean Derby, how would you find that information out legally? But obviously, I think there is that risk of GDPR and data protection that restricts a lot of what we can find out about them without getting landowners and detectorist permissions. Some are nice. Some detectorists are very nice. Others can be right stubborn so-and-sos that won't tell you anything. And the first thing they'll do is, with their new shiny, they'll stick it on eBay, sell it for 50 quid and go for an all-nighter in a pub somewhere.
The second question was, it would be handy for the museum, even if we couldn't locate the object itself, to have those photographs.
Those photos will be on the portable antiquity scheme. Would you like the copy of the PRN, not the PRN, the accession number for the PS, so you could get the images there?
I think maybe if you have whoever contact.
Yeah, I'll do that. I can do that, that's not a problem.
If we lose it, its interest, if we can't actually get the object itself. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, but I would really love it if someone could track where that Henry silver mount is as well. That would be wonderful if we could find, if it could find its way back home up here, wouldn't it? It'd be fantastic.
Any volunteers?
Yes. I'm not seeing a flurry of hands coming up to that idea though.
I was very interested to see your hypothesis that Anglesey was originally unwholesome. But are there any other examples of sound being over time turned into sea?
I can't answer that question honestly, really, because that was the only one I sort of tracked down, and I was slightly unconvinced, but it was the only one that I could find where historians particularly attribute that as being likely Anglesey. So that's why I included that in the presentation. But yeah, that's a good question. That's something I need to think about. But thanks so much for bringing that to my attention.
Any more questions? Yes.
Are the burial mounds on Anglesey connected with all this as well?
The Bronze Age ones, they're much earlier, but there is a sort of idea of, particularly in Scandinavia, in the Iron Age, there's continuing to the idea of building a burial mound. Because one, it's easier in a sense, rather than digging a hole deep down, you just dig a ditch around and put a pile on. But also it's visible. So if you're making a statement about the dead, or in many cases making a statement about the living, a mound is something very quick to get your point across that people can see it from far afield. But to answer your question, no, not really. The burial mounds in the context of sort of burial mounds at Anglesey are predominantly prehistoric. But it's certain, I would argue, certainly this idea of burying something in a mound like a boat probably originates from prehistoric activity in Scandinavia, and a practice which has continued and carried on from there to the British Isles. Again, not Christian. Don't see many burial mounds for Christians in the British Isles.
Okay. Oh, yes.
Is there it was a wonderful talk, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Is there a plan in motion or anything to excavate the possible?
Ongoing. It's been ongoing for several years now, so. But once something is planned, the problem is it's scheduled now, because it's the only one. Cadw, being informed of this discovery, were very quick to schedule it, because of course they would. What that means basically is, instead of it being a quick and easy process to excavate it like we hoped, we now have to deal with the government. And the government have now put a lot of ring fences we kind of hoped they didn't. They wouldn't do, that prevent us from being able to excavate it. And before we do that, we need to tick all our boxes and ensure that we're going to do this dig correctly. Because archaeology is a destructive process. And given the rarity of that, we're only going to get one chance. And it is a career maker and a career destroyer if we get it wrong. Because I guarantee you, no one will ever want to work with you again if you mess up the excavation, sampling, data collection on a site of that significance. Because it is unique, it's nationally important.
So what needs to happen to make it happen?
Well, money, big thing, but there are processes in place now. We can apply for HLF funding and other pots of funding depending on what post-excavation work that he's doing. That's the expensive thing, funnily enough, it's the post-ex, not the digging. The digging's costly, but the analysis, the conservation of the materials, talking like metallurgical analysis, isotopic analysis, assuming we get any bones surviving, conservation of organic materials. There was this really interesting silver pot found in Scotland where they had preserved textile around it that mineralised around the object. There's a possibility we could even find that there. Not saying that there is, it's just a possibility. But it's these things that add up as the costs. But we need also to ensure that our research methods and our aims and objectives are tight, because there will be questions being asked about this boat. Obviously, there is the obvious one, is it a boat burial or not? But also, how does this fit in within sort of the Viking Age period of Britain and the wider European continent? What can this tell us about Viking settlements and enclaves on Anglesey and beyond? Is this unique in the landscape, or are there other burial mounds? There's a myriad of questions that can arise from investigating a site like this. And it's that important thing of drilling down what we want to answer in a satisfactory way for the government and our funders and for our colleagues, basically. Because like I said, there's a lot to lose, but plenty to gain if we do this correctly.
So, have you any idea when you might?
No. I'm afraid not. If you hear it before me, that'd be great.
Okay, has everybody finished asking questions? Can we just show our appreciation to our...
Let me see, where did I get... Oh, there they are. Right.